Today, December 4th, 2020, marks the first ever virtual oral history project interview for the American Institute for Mining, Metallurgical, and Petroleum Engineers Incorporated via AIME's Zoom account due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of interviewing Mr. George Jedenoff. George has a wealth of experience in the steel industry, thanks to over 30 years at United States Steel Corporation, followed by 3 years as president of Kaiser Steel Corp. And 8 years of consulting in the steel industry and general management. My name is Britt MacKinnon. I'm a process engineer in training at Hatch and a Young Professionals Chair at the Association for Iron and Steel Technology, AIST. George, thank you for your willingness to help us capture your story in this way.
Thank you, Britt. You're very kind, and I feel very honored to have this opportunity.
George, let's start at the beginning of your 103-year-long journey. Please tell me about your early childhood. Where did you grow up? I understand you are descended from Russian royalty.
Actually, Russian nobility. Russian royalty is the small group of the Tsar and family. Nobility is the much broader group, but both my parents were, for many centuries actually, members of the Russian nobility. Yes, I've had a long life, 103 years, surprising, but I was born in a little town you probably never heard of. It's called Petrozavodsk, which is a couple of 100 miles from St. Petersburg. And it was the central office of the Murmansk to St. Petersburg Railroad. And my dad was an official of the railroad. He was a graduate engineer from Kiev Polytechnic Institute, and he was stationed there. And I was born in 1917, about 2 months before the big revolution that started in St. Petersburg, very close to us. And it was a very violent revolution. And my parents decided they should get further away from there because it was just too dangerous. And it was very violent. There was no questions asked. You just got shot or tortured or something else. So we got moved to a couple of locations. And then as the revolution progressed, my dad filed for a transfer, and he was transferred to the Chinese Eastern Railroad in Harbin, Manchuria. It's a very interesting railroad. It was built by Russia, operated by Russia on land that was leased from China by the Tsar in 1897, and the railroad was built about the same time as the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is much better known. But it's a shortcut to the seaport of Vladivostok, which was very important, especially during the revolution, because that's where supplies, armaments were brought in. into Russia. And so it was a shortcut, and it was across relatively flat land compared to that portion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was along the Amur River and quite unstable. So we were there for several years until it became apparent that the revolution was going to hold fast, and that so my dad decided to investigate going to America. And when I was 4 years old, he sent my mother with my older brother and I to California, where he had some contacts, and we were there for several months, and then decided to come back and make a recommendation to my dad that we should immigrate. Now, my dad spoke, and my mother, neither one of them spoke any English, so this was going to be quite a change. And so he filed for immigration, and we were granted admittance into the United States. And so in 1923, when I was not quite 6 years old, we immigrated and we settled in Seattle, Washington, and we were sponsored. You had to have a sponsor, and we were sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church. And but it was kind of an unfortunate period. It was a complete change of life for my parents, and not knowing the language. The economy got bad about that point. And earlier in his career, my dad served as a chairman of a railroad, international railroad committee that came through Russia. And the head of the Milwaukee St. Paul Railroad was very impressed with my dad. And he said that if you ever come over, you look me up. So sure enough, when we landed, my dad tried to get in touch with this gentleman. And unfortunately, he died about 3 months before that. So we had no contacts whatsoever. So we started life in California, and then, in Seattle, Washington. And then about that time, the Depression came along, and that really was tough. So that was my earlier beginning. My parents went through a terrible adjustment period, even if the economy were better, and the strain was pretty heavy. So when I was about 11 years old, unfortunately, my parents separated, and my mother moved to California, and she was awarded me by the divorce judge, and my brother stayed with my dad in Seattle. So that's where the beginning started.
Wow, what a journey. Now, I understand your father was a mechanical engineer, so it seems that engineering may have been in your blood.
Yes, it was. The only real technical university in Russia was in the Ukraine, which was part of Russia at that time, and it was called the Kiev Polytechnic Institute. So my dad took mechanical engineering with a major in railroad management, and that was his start. But yeah, I don't know why. When you're growing up, you're thinking, what do you want to do with your life and whatnot? And engineering seemed the most attractive to me, and that's what I followed.
Awesome. Why did you choose to study at Stanford?
Well, Stanford is an outstanding university, and even in those days, when it was not quite as famous as it is today, I just felt it was the best university in the area. And having visited it once, I just fell in love with the school. I just thought this was the place. But I didn't have any money, and but I was playing football for the Polytechnic High School, and we won the 10 games out of 10. We had the city championship, and I applied for a scholarship. Of course, I'm only 5'7", and but people weren't as big in those days. If you had a lineman that weighed 280 pounds, he was a giant. And so I applied for a scholarship, and but times were tough. There wasn't much money. The depression was hitting, and the Alumni Association had a program where they would interview people, and so I went and I met the chairman of the Hercules Powder Company. He was a guy about my height and outweighed me by 50 pounds. And he sized me up and he says, "Hey, kid, you're kind of little." And what are you going to say? And then he looked at me and says, "You got any guts? Are you willing to work?" And I wasn't sure I knew the answer, but I said yes. And so he got me a job working underground in the mines at age 18. The first job I ever had, working with a pick and shovel, and it was a magnesite mine, which is a mineral that later on I found out was very important in the steel industry as a refractory. And we got paid 50 cents an hour working in that thing, and we were way out in the sticks, and they had a dormitory where all the miners lived, because it was just too far from any other place, and we had to pay out $1.50 a day for room and board, so that left $2.50 a day for the work. But I worked all summer, and there was another fellow that was on the same program with me that went to Stanford. We were lifelong friends, and his name was Paul Durkel, great guy. And he and I got to work 7 days a week, even though the mine worked just 6. There was nowhere to go, and we just did general cleanup maintenance work. And then we stayed at night, and the miners, there were about 250 of them. They were a pretty tough bunch of guys, and they drank red wine after dinner and played poker, but they wouldn't let us kids do anything like that. And as a matter of fact, it ended up like we had 260 fathers. They took a personal interest in us, and they wanted to make sure that we made something out of our lives. And, for young kids, that was pretty hard to beat. So that was my experience. During that summer, I was notified by Stanford that they didn't have enough money. So, but not to get discouraged, I could borrow money. They would help me find jobs. And so I went ahead and decided I would try and go as long as my money lasted. And I had enough for about 2/4 of three. Stanford was on a 3/4 system. And I said, well, I was going to go 2/4, and I could always say I went to Stanford. And it lasted me 6 years. So it turned out pretty good. But at the end of the first year, which was very, very difficult, I qualified for their best scholarship, a George Gamble scholarship, and I was able to maintain that for the rest of my 4 years at Stanford undergrad. So that's the way it went.
Amazing. Now, while studying at Stanford, did you create a mentorship relationship with any of your professors?
Yes, there were a number, but my most favorite one was rather unusual. His name was Stephen Timoshenko, and he was a world-famous engineer. He wrote the Bible on strength of materials, and oddly enough, he was from Kiev Polytechnic Institute, and he was my father's professor in 1910. Then he went into Westinghouse research, and after the war, and but he preferred teaching, and so he became a professor at Michigan, and he wrote the Bible at that time, and a few years later, Stanford talked him into coming to Stanford, and it was interesting that he was my father's professor and my professor, 1910 and 1940. But he was a wonderful teacher and an excellent man. So he was one that really helped me. In the Graduate School of Business, which I got my MBA, I majored in production management. And there was a professor, Paul Holman, who was a brilliant guy. As a matter of fact, as the war started, he was picked as the head of the OPA, which is the Office of Production Administration that handled all the material. We shifted from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. All the demands for materials and everything became different, and there were shortages, and there had to be a czar that decided who got what. Well, Paul Holden got that job, but at Stanford he taught executive management. He was and he had been a consultant, and he was brilliant. Maybe one reason I liked him is he gave me 2 A+ on my grades. He only gave 3 of those out in his lifetime. So I felt pretty good about that. But Paul and remained friends for many years. So that's kind of my background there.
George, what was your first professional job in the industry?
Well, I worked every summer because I needed the money, number one. Number two is I was trying to find out what I wanted to do in life. And by working in the mines, in the oil fields, in petroleum refinery, I had at least a glance at what life was like. And one of my jobs was to work for U.S. Steel in a steel mill. And I enjoyed that job more than anything because I could see there was a place for my technical education, but also it involved working with people. And I decided that's what I really wanted to do. And through, throughout my life, I've really enjoyed the challenge of getting people to enjoy their work and to improve productivity. That was the thing that professionally I enjoyed the most, and having worked in blue collar jobs and then working up through the steel industry as a foreman, I was able to eventually become president of a steel company. But the challenge there for me always was working with the people and how do you get them? What used to bother me was somebody would say, "Oh, I don't know. I just work here." And, that's, and I just work for the money. And there's no job satisfaction, no pleasure. How do you get people to enjoy what they're doing? And that was what motivated me, and I had some wonderful experience uh, developing the leadership and the motivation. But a lot of it was just the attitude involved in managing, and that's what even well. I actually had my first experience in the Navy. Well, I was in charge of a group of about 120 sailors, and how we could get performance out of the people. You know, you could say, I'm an officer, so therefore I order you to do this. And you know what kind of performance you get to your face, it's something, but beyond it. So what do you do to actually get them to do their job to their best satisfaction? And that's what really interested me. My greatest satisfaction came when I was in my second uh, stint at managing a steel plant. I went from a small plant in Pittsburgh, California, to a larger plant in Utah called Geneva Steel. And there I had an opportunity to try out my theories and what was involved. And that was, in my whole career in the steel industry, was probably the most telling important experience that I'd ever had. And it didn't start out that way. It started out with a steel plant that was in trouble. It was a war baby built 800 miles from the coast so that it would not be bombed by enemy submarines and there was raw materials there, but not the best. It takes coal, iron ore, and limestone. Those are the three things that you need to make steel. And Utah had those, but not to the same extent. So the Defense Plant Corporation, when we were still in the National Defense Program, authorized the steel plant. And then as the war started, there was a shortage of people, of course. There was all the recruitment to the military and then the expansion of such facilities. So this plant was started with by bringing in experienced people, but a lot of them were ones that had no leadership experience. They just knew the operations, and that's the way they ran. And it was in a rural area, in a farm area, and they had very little employment opportunities. So there were people graduated from BYU University, University of Utah, that would take jobs in this new mill, even though they were non-professional jobs. But a lot of their supervisors were brought in from other plants that were available. And again, because they knew the operation, but not how to manage. So that in many cases, the employees had a lot more education than the supervisors. And so there was a lot of friction, and but because of the war, there was still some patriotic reason. But after the war ended, and U.S. Steel was managing this plant for the United States Defense Corporation, they were going to walk away because they didn't need these big plates and structurals that were there for shipbuilding. Didn't need any more ships, and but it became the single biggest industry in Utah, and the political pressure was tremendous to for U.S. Steel to buy the facilities, so they could continue to operate in Utah in spite of the problems, and that's what happened. But the conversion was difficult, and there were some bad labor influence that realized that there was a shortage of steel for domestic purposes, and they could take advantage of the situation. And the plant developed a terrible reputation for work stoppages, even though the contract did not permit unauthorized work stoppages. We averaged about 8 of these a year for about 10 years. And they were supplying material for my plant, and I was general superintendent of the Pittsburgh plant at that point. And but it was terrible material. So I in a scientific way, marked down all the problems that we had and documented and all that stuff. And I went to my boss and he kept showing how our performance was adversely affected. And finally, one day, my boss called me and he says, we have a solution to your problem. And I said, well, what is that? He said, we're going to send you to Utah to be in charge of that plant. I thought, oh boy, that's what happens when you complain too much. And went over there, and I thought I was being sent to Siberia because we did. No one really knew that area very well. As it turned, I was there for 6 years, and I really loved the place. That's where I, at age 43, I took up skiing for the first time, and that became a lifetime activity, including this year. I've gone some 54 years without missing a single year of skiing. But anyway, that's the story. I really built my life, strengthened my beliefs in that plant, in converting it to a very efficient plant from a very troubled plant. That's where all this, I developed this theory of shared competitive responsibility, where employees share the responsibility for their own success, let alone improvement in the performance. And I had a lot of trouble with organized labor. I had trouble internally because a lot of our supervision just wasn't adequately trained. So my first effort was to do our own job, do our own housekeeping, improve the leadership, improve the knowledge. And it all got around communications. You got to understand what's involved and what's at risk. And so we started with that. We either replaced supervisors, but basically we sent them through 6 weeks of organized training, about 12 at a time. And that became very important. And in the meantime, we communicated with the employees. And the union put out their regular newspaper. At one point, they charged me with negligence and industrial immorality, and in headlines. But gradually, as we solved the problems and improved our leadership and improved communications, there was an election of the union officers, and two guys ran against the incumbent who had been there, to the point where they even called the Union Hall the Wilford A. Biggs Hall, who was the guy. These two guys ran against him, and Mr. Biggs came out third of the three in the ballot. But it took a lot of while, and so that we had to put up with them. The theory there was that you got to do your own job right. And if you do your job right, then you can be as strict as you want. But what was happening is that the management wasn't always that careful in what they did. And so they'd have these strikes, and then top management couldn't defend them. So that became an incentive for people to, even if they knew what they were doing was wrong, was to follow the union rule. So I wasn't anti-union. I was anti-irresponsible union. And so this is what we worked. And the whole program was built around making, well, my theory here was that every person in the organization has to have a viable job. If he has a job that's not important, get rid of it. Even though the union will buckle you for it, but you got to get rid of it. But every job that is viable has to be important. And if it's important, it's just like in a football team. The ball carrier makes a lot of yards, but somebody's blocking for him. He doesn't get much credit for it. But if he doesn't block for him, the ball carrier can't carry it. So we tried to build the same team concept where everybody understands his role and why it's important, and that any mistake he makes isn't a mistake against management or one he can get away with. He's hurting his own teammates in their performance and trying to compete. And we tried to get that feeling of responsibility and the importance and the personal satisfaction that you get from doing your job right. Even if your job is menial, if it's important, it has to be done. And mistakes made hurts the team. This is how we started this program, and we finally got to the point where we also, we had to have tremendous amount of communications throughout this to understand what our situation is, what our competitive position is. Here we have a plant that's no longer in a place where there's a market. So we had to compete with the West Coast 800 miles away. You got transportation charges, you got material, some of which are not as high grade. And we have to overcome all those things in order to be competitive. So we couldn't afford mistakes. So we call this Error Zero, and started this program where we're relying on everyone to do his job better. And we had incentives in their performance. We would call in employees, a foreman would call in guys and said, look, we got this problem. What can we do to solve it? So now he's asking them for help and getting them on the point. And then now they become involved in doing this, and they get the personal satisfaction of being on a winning team. And that's what we build up. And it took time. It took several years, took training, it took a lot of personal change in attitude. And once they could see results and could share in the same in the success of it, then their own performance improved. They felt better. They felt they were going to work to do a job, not just to get paid, and not to just go through the motions. And this is what took years to do. We converted this plant to the highest dollars per ton produced profit of any plant in the U.S. Steel Corporation. Now, not total profit, but profit per ton, because we weren't as big as some others. And the plant gained quite a bit of success. Later on, when I got promoted a couple of times and I was in headquarters, America was concerned about, in the West Coast, we got hit by foreign competition right away. The rest of the country didn't really feel it, but some 10 years later, foreign competition was affecting the whole country, and not just in steel, but in all products. And there was a lot of concern of what's the matter with American productivity. And Congressman Charles Goobster was on the Foreign Relations Committee of Congress, and he called for an all-day meeting and got a hold of all the top business people, corporate leaders in all industries to come to this conference. The chairman of U.S. Steel was invited, but he called me in and said, you should go in there, George, and represent us. So that was quite an honor. So I spoke to Congress and on what we did, and again, it was a shared competitive responsibility, and it was very well received by the Defense Department, by NASA. They were all very complimentary with what they heard. So that was really the big thing in my life. That everything from there on was kind of downhill.
What are some of the results of the Air Zero program?
Yes, there were some very surprising results. There's the typical ones where certain operations were done better, but one in particular, there's an operation called Stopper Maker. He's the fellow who has to perform manual labor in adjusting the stopper that fits in the ladle that the steel is poured in. The problem is workmanship, and sometimes you develop leakers, which leaks some of the molten steel. So it's a very skilled operation, but manual. It's interesting how the ladle stopper makers took on the program and would keep score of the number of consecutive ladles that they fixed without a stopper. And some of them were able to double the performance that they had before. And of course, they'd be very proud of it. And it became competitive among the employees, and they'd keep track of them. So there is one, and that is a pretty costly operation. So it's a wonderful thing. In my office at the steel plant in Geneva, my assistant, Carl Forkham, and I each had an office, and then there was a an office in between them, which his secretary and my secretary shared. And one time I came in, and here they were reading to each other, and I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we've been typing out these letters to employees and others about error-free work, and we just decided that, by gosh, there wasn't going to be a single letter going out of this office that had a mistake in it. So we're checking on each other to see." And I thought, well, gosh, here's something they took on all by themselves. Another strange example is in our work duty. Occasionally, we have employees who get injured and they no longer can perform their job, and so we try to provide employment for them. This is a case of a rigger, which is a pretty high-priced guy who fell and injured himself, who was no longer able to perform his job. So he got a job as a custodian in the men's change room. And, that's kind of a menial job. But this rigger got the message, and his job now was a custodian, not a rigger. And he thought, gosh, we got all this talk about workmanship and neatness and whatnot, and these change rooms are messy. Sometimes the toilets aren't flushed and the paper's on the paper. So I decided that I was going to make this change room as neat as could be, so that when employees come to work, they see right away a clean place, and it encourages them to do better work. And he just did this on his own. And then he felt so much better that he was now really contributing to the program, even if it wasn't. That's just a kind of there were hundreds of these kind of examples that occurred that not only improved the performance, but gave personal satisfaction to the employee involved. And let's see, there was one more thing. In one thing I've learned over the years is that you've also got to learn how to listen. Now, that has taken a little effort on my part, but if you're trying to understand a person and what he's doing and try to help, you've got to also listen what's involved. You may disagree with him, but unless you hear what his story is, you can never come to a solution. So listening is very important, and staying positive. And communications are so important, both ways. And that's what brings about understanding. So many problems could be solved if people are trying to listen to what the other person's viewpoint is. And you may not want to accept it, but at least understand why. And that takes a certain amount of maturity on your part and discipline to do that. And I think that's very important.